Welcome to Earth-Kind Bulbs for Texas and the South. Hi, I'm Greg Grant, Smith County Horticulturist for the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service in Tyler, Texas. I've been in love with bulbs for a long time. Here you can see me playing a little Dutch boy in kindergarten program at Peggy Ann's alongside my sister Carrie, dreaming of being a Dutch tulip farmer. Didn't quite work out that way, but we got to start a dream somewhere. I grew up with bulbs in the countryside in deep East Texas at old home places. The problem was I thought of them as wildflowers. I didn't really know that they were flower bulbs, and I really didn't appreciate them as I should at the time. They were pretty, however. Later, as I studied horticulture, I realized there were bigger and better things out there. Showy bulbs, a whole industry based in Holland, lots of catalogs, and lots of things that I wanted. Of course, the whole world's in love with tulips, as I was at 5 years old. Unfortunately, tulips aren't perennials in Texas. Oftentimes, they're not even good annuals in Texas. The bulbs that do best in Texas are those that we call time-tested. And so it was important that I saw those old home places growing up, because those bulbs have been flowering for decades, sometimes even 100 years, for generations and generations. Some of the cultivars even hundreds of years old, some of even 1,000 years old. And that's what we call time-tested. And those actually make up the bulk of the bulbs I grow these days, because I know that they're going to return, and I know that they're going to survive. But there are many other bulbs out there, and so I'll trial lots of bulbs. I've been conducting bulb trials for some 30 years now, and I've probably trialed some 200 different kinds of narcissus and daffodils and jonquils alone, only to find about 20 that do well in Texas and the South. And there's probably more out there, and there are new ones that come along, and so I really enjoyed planting them and finding out who grows and who doesn't. Unfortunately, it's a very small percentage of those that are available that do well here. If I'm not mistaken, I think there's something like 30,000 cultivars of daffodils out there, with only a handful that really do that well here. The bulbs that I promote are what we call earth-kind bulbs. To be an earth-kind bulb, you need to be long-lived, require no chilling. I don't have a room in my refrigerator to be storing bulbs in there. No irrigation. The bulbs that we grow, they work on a wet-dry cycle and actually need to be dry during the summer, at least the spring and the fall bulbs that we grow. Summer bulbs that do well here can survive the summers without irrigation, but do better if they do have irrigation or rainfall. Earth-kind bulbs that I like to grow and promote require no fertilizer, no bone meal, no special bulb fertilizers, no pesticides. I don't spray them with anything, and they don't need to be divided. There are some bulbs that do fairly well here for a short period of time, then you have to dig and divide them periodically. Large flowered daffodils would be a good example. I'm going to teach you a little bit about bulbs before we talk about individual bulbs that grow here, what I call bulbs 101. A bulb is a herbaceous plant with a fleshy underground storage organ made up of modified leaves. And so the bulb that we actually hold in our hands, like an onion, each of those rings in an onion or a flower bulb was made from a leaf. This includes both annual and perennial types, some examples being daffodils, amaryllis, and lilies. Often loosely includes other types of storage organs, including tubers like caladiums, corms such as gladiolus, rhizomes like iris, tuberous roots, daylilies would be an example, etc. Annual bulbs are a bulbous plant that is only useful for one season, that doesn't reliably return and bloom each year. Good examples would be tulips, Dutch hyacinths, and caladiums. Short-lived bulbs would be bulbous plants that only perform well for a few years and gradually decline. Examples would be certain large flowered daffodils, most true lilies, and most gladiolus, especially the florist types. Spring bulbs are those bulbs that bloom in the late winter or early spring. Most of these grow foliage during the winter and spring, go dormant during the summer. Examples would be jonquils, snowflakes, and narcissus. Summer bulbs are those bulbs that grow and bloom during the late spring and summer. Most of these are tropical in origin, go dormant during the winter, and are somewhat tender and grown primarily outdoors only in the south, typically not grown in the north or in Europe unless in greenhouses or containers. Examples of summer bulbs here would be crinums, hymenicalis, and cannas. Fall bulbs are those bulbs that bloom in the late summer and fall after a summer drought-induced dormancy. They normally bloom without foliage and grow foliage during the fall and winter. They don't want summer irrigation. Matter of fact, if you irrigate them during the summer, they won't bloom. Examples would be spider lilies or lycoris, oxblood lilies, and rain lilies. They do require moisture during the fall and winter and early spring, but not during the summer. Naturalized means when bulbs multiply and spread on their own from seed and seemingly grow wild like they did in nature. Perennialized is when bulbs return each year as perennials but may or may not naturalize from seed. There are a good many perennial bulbs that are sterile hybrids and set no seed. Characteristics of bulbs in general would be easy to grow, low maintenance, drought tolerant, light feeders, more expensive than other plants, long-lived, and mostly propagated by division. I say more expensive because if I knew then what I knew now, I would pay $1,000 a piece for about 20 bulbs instead of the thousands and thousands of dollars I've spent for hundreds and hundreds of bulbs that are now dead. And that goes for all plants. It's all about value. And the soil requirements of bulbs in general are that they're not particular. Good drainage is best for most of them. And the annual types like tulips require an annual soil mix or a potting soil to do their best. We're going to start out with Narcissus. Of course, Narcissus is from Greek mythology. He was the son of Cephisses and Liriope. Famously stared at himself in the water until he turned into a narcissus flower. Narcissus are in the amaryllis family. They're bulbs from Europe. They can naturalize, which means multiply and spread by seed like a wildflower, or they can perennialize, which, as I said, returns and multiply in the clumps but don't spread. And of course, some of them don't grow at all. So we're going to talk about those that do well here today. I divide the genus Narcissus up into 3 different general common name categories. Now, the American Daffodil Society divides it up into 13. Well, I'm going to get it down to 3 for you. These are just my own general rules. Daffodils are those that descend from Narcissus pseudonarcissus and their offspring. They include those that have single flowers with big cups in the middle, or a corona. 1 flower per stem, generally don't have any scent or just a little bit. They mostly come in yellow with a few whites or bicolors, and they have wide blue-green foliage. And daffodils would be the most important and the most popular of all the Narcissus species. Of course, the most famous daffodil poem of all was written by William Wordsworth in England. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. He goes on, but he was inspired literally by the same Narcissus pseudonarcissus that we find naturalized across the South. And it's pretty amazing for a daffodil to grow in both England and in Texas and the South, but the little Lent Lily, or Narcissus pseudonarcissus, does that. Unfortunately, the most popular daffodils in the world, including here, are the great big flowered daffodils, what we call the King Alfred types. Unfortunately, the large flowered daffodils that were bred for show flowers are not the best perennial garden flowers here. So even though they're spectacular, and we know this from other flowers too, just because you're pretty doesn't mean you survive here as a good garden flower. What happens with large flowered daffodils is they tend to bloom well for 3 or 4 years and then multiply and make foliage for the rest of your life. And if it was a collard or a turnip green or a cabbage, that'd be fine to make foliage for the rest of our lives. But we don't grow daffodils for the foliage, so you have to be really careful in purchasing large flowered daffodils, because most of them aren't going to bloom for very long. So people often ask me, how many years does it have to live before I say it's adapted to the South? My rule is at least 20 years and preferably 200 years. So I don't want to take the time to plant something as a perennial when it's not going to be a perennial, or I'm going to have to do extra work to dig and divide them every 5 to 10 years when I know there are some out there that I never have to dig and divide. The ones that are adapted here, in this case, here you see some Texas Star Jonquils, Narcissus intermedius, tend to not only live and multiply, but bloom every year reliably without needing to be divided. And the nice thing about everything in the Narcissus genus, which includes all daffodils, jonquils, narcissus, and for that matter, everything in the amaryllis family, they have toxic foliage. And even though they're not known for poisoning animals, they're made that way in nature to be distasteful and to keep animals from browsing on them. And so that's why you'll see narcissus, daffodils, jonquils, amaryllis, rain lilies in fields and pastures where you have deer and cows and horses, and they don't eat them because they have mucilaginous sap and toxins in the foliage that keeps them from being grazed down. And as we know, with problems with deer, they tend to graze on lots of things and eat lots of things to the ground, but they won't do this to things in the Amaryllis family. Now, I grow lots of flower bulbs because ever since I was a child, I've been digging and dividing and planting those, not the showiest ones, because I found out some of the showiest ones don't live. It's not because I didn't plant them. I've learned it all the hard way. So I take those that do live and do multiply and do bloom every year, and I divide and plant and divide and plant. And literally in my life, I've taken as few as a handful of bulbs. Some of them I started with 1, 3, or 6 bulbs and eventually turned them into thousands and thousands. So I'm going to show you a few of the places that I plant bulbs in what I call a naturalizing fashion, even though most of them are sterile hybrids that don't set seed. But they're really old hybrids and really old species, old-fashioned things mostly. And so here you see a planting in my parents' house where there's about an acre where we plant jonquils and narcissus and daffodils for spring bloom, and then oxblood lilies and spider lilies for fall bloom. There's another property where my great-grandparents lived, where I took all the bulbs in the yard that bloomed to my great-grandmother, and to make it easier for the guy that mows the yard, I moved them all out behind the house. And so these are all old-fashioned jonquils, narcissus, and daffodils in the springtime, and once again spider lilies in the fall that I dug and divided and put out back behind the house. I do the same thing in the front acre in front of my house where my maternal grandparents lived, mostly old-fashioned cultivars as well. And then I have another old house that I just use for storage, and I use it for a catch-all for any kind of daffodil, narcissus, and jonquil in the springtime. In the fall, I actually have pink oxblood lilies, pink rain lilies, and pink spider lilies there. And so 2 times a year when I can have a show, and I don't actually have to cultivate anything. Now, even though the best time to plant bulbs is when they're dormant, like you would be purchasing from our sale and others and catalogs, I have to tell you that I dig and divide most of mine when they're in full bloom. And you think that's a little bit crazy. Well, no, that's the way, one, it's when I can see them blooming and I know what's there. And so I dig and divide them just like I would be dividing monkey grass or daylilies. And you might dig an old clump that might have, anywhere from 50 to 75 bulbs in there. And I pull them apart, I put them in a bucket of water, and I go around and plant them in the springtime. So once my wife asked me what I was doing out there with the bucket and shovel, and I said, painting. And she said, what do you mean painting? Well, literally, when you can see the colors of the flowers and you know what you have, you can paint a picture on the landscape. And so the worst thing that can happen when you dig and divide one in full bloom is it's going to skip the next year's bloom. But with something that I know is going to bloom for the rest of my life, it doesn't seem that big a deal to miss 1 year's bloom. So remember, dormant season is best, but you can dig and divide those that are truly adapted year-round here. Now, some things that you don't want to do. You don't want to tie up the foliage, and this is very important because everybody loves flowers on spring bulbs, but nobody likes to see the foliage go dormant. As long as that foliage is green, it's like a solar panel producing energy. And so every flower that you have on the bulb was produced from last year's foliage. So when you bloom a bulb the first year, you're not responsible for that. Whoever farmed that bulb or grew the bulb the previous year is the one that produced that flower in that bulb. So you're only responsible starting the second year. And so you have to leave that foliage on there to mature and develop food and energy to store up a bloom for next year. And so as long as it's green, don't tie it up, don't braid it, and don't cut it off. And so typically for me, I'll mow or cut off the foliage of my narcissus and jonquils and daffodils when they start to turn yellow, which is no time before Mother's Day. So Mother's Day is the cutoff for me when I start thinking about cutting the foliage of the bulb. So if it looks green, don't cut it off, or you won't have any flowers for next year. If you cut it off every year while it's green, they're going to die in 4 or 5 years by starving to death. Let's look at some of the bulbs that we have in the sale. Of course, this is the presentation for the Smith County Master Gardener Association Bulbs to Bloom Conference and Sale, which we're doing virtually this year. And so instead of hearing me in person in October like you typically would, we're recording it, put the PowerPoint online for you. And so one of the bulbs we have in the sale is the Lent Lily or Narcissus, pseudonarcissus. This is the original parent of almost all daffodils on the planet. And so it's that same little wild species that William Wordsworth wrote about. It's small flowered, early blooming, also goes by the name of Virginia daffodil and early daffodil, called the Lent Lily because it generally blooms around the Lenten season. They're small flowered. They're fairly short, sometimes 6 inches, certainly less than a foot. And there's a reason that they're small, and the flowers kind of nod a little bit. These plants evolved over thousands of years growing in the wild, and so they weren't bred to be a show flower. They were bred to be a surviving perennial that blooms early, late winter, early spring, and the petals kind of cupped over the trumpet, and the trumpet's all there to attract a bee and give it a little protection from the elements. And so where compared to a huge flowered show daffodil might not look like much, there's nothing prettier in the springtime than the Lent lilies blooming at the tail end of winter and the beginning of spring. So a great perennial, and it will naturalize. It's a true wild species that sets seed, and very rare in the trade, so I produce and dig these myself for our sale. So that's the Lent Lily. Some of the other daffodils we have in the sale, one of them is Barrett Browning, which is an early mid-season bloomer that has white petals and bright orange flowers. It was bred to be a showier flower, but it is a good perennial for most of Texas, and especially the East Texas and the Southeast. So here you see Barrett Browning blooming in my garden. Bittern is a new one that I've been trialing. It's a cluster flowered type. Probably really belongs in the Narcissus category. The American Daffodil Society considers all of them daffodils. A botanist would consider them all Narcissus, but I'm going to divide them up into daffodils, jonquils, and Narcissus for you. So Bittern is a new one out there, and here you can see it in my trial row, where it's multiplied well and blooms well. So probably something that you haven't been growing, you might want to try. A cultivar called Bittern, B-I-T-T-E-R-N. Carlton is probably the most famous yellow daffodil in the world. It looks like a traditional daffodil. Luckily small enough and close enough to the wild species. It's a good perennial, not so gargantuan that it's short-lived, and so probably the most numerous and most commonly sold yellow daffodil in the entire world. Probably going to need digging and dividing every 10 to 15 years, and for some people that's worth it, and to me it is. But here you can see what a good perennial it is. This is Mr. Frank Wagner of Jacksonville, Texas, with his dog Cassie. Years ago, somebody gave his wife some daffodil bulbs. She planted them. After she passed away, Mr. Wagner goes out there and digs and divides them each year, and now it's filled up an entire pasture full, and it's quite spectacular. And if I'm not mistaken, today is Mr. Wagner's 93rd birthday. So happy birthday, Mr. Wagner, and your beautiful field of Carlton daffodils. Ceylon is one that's relatively new. I say new, a lot of these things are new to gardeners, even though they might have been in the trade for a while. It was bred to be a real sturdy show flower, but it happens to be a really good perennial as well. And so I'm always surprised each year that we don't sell more Ceylon, because here you see one of my naturalized plantings, and this is growing in clay in St. Augustine grass near a pond where normally just jonquils and snowflakes do well. So I was really surprised when almost everything I planted along there died, but Ceylon continued to live. And so it's an early mid-season bloomer with yellow petals and orange cups. February Gold is a cyclamenous hybrid. It's an early bloomer, hence the name February Gold. Looks a little bit like the Lent Lily, except more refined petals, and because of its cyclamenous parentage, it has those swept back petals on there. And there you see some nice healthy clumps of February Gold in front of my parents' house. Ice Follies, possibly the second most numerous daffodil sold in the world. It's a big flower. It looks like something that wouldn't be perennial, but it is. It has white petals that open up with an orange, really flaring, yellow cup in the middle that fades to white. And I love the look you get with the bicolors of everything from yellow to white in the flower. So that's the Ice Follies daffodil. And here's a planting I visited years ago, Mr. Butler in North Louisiana. I'm sure he's long passed on, but a good percentage of his planting around his old homestead was Ice Follies. You can see this, much of the white scattered in there are Ice Follies daffodils. Now this is a new one that I've only trialed for 3 or 4 years now, Obdum. And from the very first time I planted it, I knew something was different because it bloomed well the first year, it bloomed well the second year, it bloomed well the third year. It continues to multiply. And here you see my nice stand of them. And there's a reason why. This is the double sport of Ice Follies. And so it's the same plant as Ice Follies. It just has fully double flowers. The only double sport of ice follies I'd grown in the past wasn't fully stable, and it went back and forth from double to single. So this is one that I really would like to see people try, and I'm not going to stop until I have thousands of them. It's Obdum, the double sport of ice follies daffodil. And you can see anytime you see a bud that big and fat on a daffodil, or a narcissus for that matter, you know it's going to be a double. Smiling Twin has a new, relatively new little daffodil bred by Brent Heath in Virginia. So it's an American bred daffodil, actually a jonquil hybrid. And you see the real pretty flared yellow cups and the white petals giving a nice bicolor appearance. And there you see some planted naturalistic style. Tahiti is a really showy double daffodil. I'm not sure how long it's going to stay blooming without dividing, but it's so pretty and it's done well early on that I think everybody should try it. It's Tahiti double flowered daffodil with yellow and orange petals mixed together. Thalia is an old triandrous hybrid, which was a species of Narcissus called Angel Tears, and so it looks like a larger flowered example of Narcissus triandrous. And so beautiful white flowers, a late season bloomer. There are so many yellows, it's nice to have some whites and primrose yellows to mix in the plantings. Of course, most of our stuff that does well blooms early, and there aren't that many mid-season, and there are very few late season bloomers that do well, and Thalia is one of them. Tweety Bird is a new one that I've been trialing for a few years now. It also has a cyclaminius in its parentage with the swept-back petals and the really long trumpet in the middle. And so it's like a sort of a long-nosed version of February Gold that blooms later. And so there's my stand of Tweety Bird in one of my trial plantings. The next group that I'm going to talk about are jonquils. Jonquils descend from Narcissus jonquilla, which is the little wild jonquil of Spain and Portugal. Jonquils are known for small yellow flowers, powerful sweet fragrance that most people adore, and round dark green foliage, somewhat like a bulrush that grows along the edge of the water. Matter of fact, the name jonquilla is actually a corruption of the genus Juncus for rushes. We don't have any straight Narcissus jonquilla in the Smith County Master Gardener's Bulbs to Bloom sale this year, but we do have a look-alike Narcissus fernandesii, and looks essentially like the wild species jonquil that I grew up with. Round foliage, clusters of bright yellow flowers in the springtime that are very fragrant, and so it's considered a mid-season bloomer, where most of the wild jonquils that grow around me are early season bloomers, so it extends that jonquil season. You see them in my trial row. I love trialing plants. I love to see the few that really do well and multiply and continue to bloom right alongside those that wither away and die. So that's Narcissus fernandesii, a jonquil look-alike for us. This is Narcissus wilkomii, which is also jonquil-like, except it occurs on a very dwarf plant and blooms later in the season. And it's the cutest thing you've ever seen, basically a miniature jonquil that's been multiplying and performing well for me. So that's Narcissus wilkomii. Golden Echo is a Brent and Becky Heath jonquil hybrid from Brent and Becky's Bulbs in Virginia. Has beautiful white petals, a bright yellow cup, and a beautiful yellow halo around that cup. And so that's an American jonquil hybrid, Golden Echo. Kokopelli looks a lot like Golden Dawn, which many of you probably already grow, including myself. We don't have Golden Dawn in the sale this year. Kokopelli blooms about the same time, a little earlier. It'd be a mid to late season bloomer. Clusters of yellow flowers that fade to pale yellow. A really good performer. And there you see him in my trial planting. Sweet Love is another Brent and Becky jonquil hybrid. Has more of an apricot cup and the white petals. Performs well. That helps that it's bred in America. So that's Sweet Love, a little jonquil hybrid from Virginia. Sweetness is one that's been around a long time, and for good reason. It multiplies well. It's half jonquil and half daffodil. It's an early to mid-season bloomer. sturdy petals, makes a good cut flower as well. Generally 1 to 2 flowers per stem. Here you see some sweetness in one of my naturalized plantings. For some reason, because it's such a showstopper and a good performer, I plant sweetness at the entrance to most of my properties. Of course, I sound like a land baron. Most of my properties are old home places or little patches of land, and so as far as I'm concerned, you can't have enough land and you can't have enough jonquils or narcissus or daffodils for that matter. Pipit is another jonquil hybrid that has creamy yellow flowers and white cups, makes a real pretty bicolor appearance. So once again, a jonquil hybrid, which means it has clusters of flowers. And here you see some nice stands of Pipit jonquil hybrid with the bicolor flowers. So Pipit's a good one, and it's a late season bloomer that helps extend the bloom time. Hawera has also been around for a good amount of time. It has creamy yellow flowers. It's also a triandrous hybrid that has those swept back petals on there, and so it's a good one for a different color and to add some later season bloom as well. Hawera. Campernelle Jonquil is actually a very old jonquil hybrid that's half daffodil and half jonquil, much like Sweetness. And so Sweetness is essentially a refined Campernelle. Campernelle, even though it may not be a refined cut flower, it's as sturdy and long-lived and as good a performer. It's been around, I think, since the 1600s. It was a natural hybrid found in the wild, and so it's a really good one. See, I misspelled odorus. It's the Narcissus, O-D-O-R-S, because it has the fragrance of a jonquil. And here you see a long-established stand from an old home place. This doesn't naturalize, it perennializes, and so when you see a stand of Campernelle jonquils like this, that means a bulb was planted in every one of those places. So it didn't spread by seed, even though it looks like it did. Now, sometimes they look like they've naturalized because alongside a highway or a construction site, a bulldozer might spread them around, or an armadillo or a pig, but it didn't spread by seed. So that's the Campernelle jonquil, as tough as it gets. Rare in the trade, so I actually produce these myself for the sale. Now the next group we're going to talk about, or not only in the genus Narcissus, we use the common name Narcissus. So we've talked about daffodils with a single trumpet, jonquils with the clusters of yellow flowers, and narcissus are clusters of white flowers. So they descend from Narcissus tazetta, which was Italian for little cup, because it has a small cup in the middle instead of a large cup like a daffodil. The clusters of mostly white flowers, small cups, as I mentioned, a powerful fragrance, so powerful that about 50% of the public doesn't like the fragrance because it's more than they can tolerate. So narcissus are kind of like Texans, overbearing and almost unbearable. Wide, mostly dark green foliage as opposed to blue-gray foliage like a daffodil. And unlike a lot of jonquils and many of the daffodils, Narcissus tazetta are very adapted not only to acid soils but alkaline soils too. So if you live in Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, we have black caliche. Most Narcissus tazetta cultivars do well. Sadly, the only Narcissus that's common today that most people recognize would be the paper white Narcissus, which unfortunately blooms so early it often gets zapped by winter temperatures. There used to be some 200 cultivars of Narcissus tazetta on the market, and now we're pretty much down to the one paper white. So we've got a number of different things available in the sale this year. Hope to offer even more in the future. Abba is actually a double-flowered Narcissus tazetta cultivar. It's the double-flowered sport of Cragford, which is one reason it does well here. And so it's an early to mid-season bloomer. Bridal Crown looks almost identical to Abba, blooms a little bit later from a different parentage, but really showy cut flowers and fragrant like paper whites, but not overbearing fragrance. And the general rule on Narcissus tazettas and their hybrids is the more yellow they have in the flower, the sweeter the fragrance, and the more white they have in the flower, the more, what I'd say, the obnoxious the fragrance. Although I tend to like them all, but powerful fragrances don't scare me. Cragford, the single version of the Abba cultivar, is actually an old standard in southern gardens with the white petals and the small orange cups that bloom in clusters. So that's Cragford. Falconet is a tazetta hybrid that has orange cups and yellow petals, does well, multiplies well, like most tazetta hybrids do in the south. So that's Falconet, a mid-season bloomer. Gives you a little bit of the appearance of Golden Dawn, except more orange in the cups. Geranium, very similar to Cragford, except instead of being a mid-season or early mid-season bloomer, it's a late-season bloomer. White petals and orange cups, so that's geranium. Grand Primo is a standard all across Texas and the South, a very old cultivar, at least 200 years old and still doing well. White petals, pale yellow cups that fade to almost white. Very common in old landscapes, and so like a lot of these heirloom daffodils and early hybrids and old species, they tend to outlive not only the gardener, but outlive the structures as well. And there you see some Grand Primo Narcissus at an abandoned home site in East Texas, but just as common in Central Texas as it is in East Texas and the South. And so Grand Primo is a winner. Unfortunately, rarely available in the trade, so we actually have to produce these ourselves for our sale. Martinet is another Tazetta hybrid with the orange cups and the yellow petals that fade to lighter as the season goes on. And so it gives you, once again, the appearance of Golden Dawn, equal vigor, but more of a mid-season bloomer instead of a late-season bloomer. Actually, an early mid-season bloomer. So where typically Golden Dawn will be the latest thing to bloom, Martinet gives you a similar look earlier in the season. Sir Winston Churchill is another double, similar to Abba that we looked at earlier, except it's a very late bloomer and one of the latest of all to bloom. And that's rare to have Narcissus hybrids and cultivars that do well late, because most of our really good performing ones tend to be early bloomers, February and March. And so my general rule is if you haven't done your thing here by March, certainly by April, you're not going to be a good perennial for us. And so it's rare to have something like Sir Winston Churchill that blooms in April. It's still a long-lived perennial and does well for us. So it's a good one. Some other spring bulbs that we're going to look at, things that aren't daffodils and jonquils and narcissus that we have available in the sale. One of them is the old-fashioned Perennial Leek, Allium ampiloprasum. It's a relative, actually it's the parent of elephant garlic, so it looks just like garlic. Pretty much the closest thing we can grow to the giant globe alliums like you would have in Holland. Except a long-lived perennial, makes foliage during the wintertime, blooms in the springtime, goes dormant during the summer, so the same growth habit as our other spring bulbs. It is edible. It's a mild-tasting garlic, and it'll go from a clove to a bulb that produces offsets and cloves the following year. And so a very long-lived perennial, edible, but also ornamental. Mostly I grow it as an ornamental. We also have multiplying what we call gumbo onions in the sale, which used to sell at every feed store and was a common pass along, but not so commonly available anymore. I'm married to a Cajun that has to put green onions in everything, and so if you want green onions during the fall, the winter, and early spring, multiplying onions are what you grow. They have the same growth habit as our other spring bulbs. They go dormant during the summertime. When you dig them up, put them in a basket, put them in the shed, put them in a barn somewhere, and then get them planted by about September, October each year. One bulb turns into a clump of bulbs, and so that's why it's frequently a pass-along plant, is because before long you've got so many you don't know what to do with them. So it only takes a few to make enough foliage to have green onions for cooking, and then each year you can have a lot of them to share or give away. So that's the multiplying green onion or gumbo onion, or some people would call them winter onions. It does have pretty flowers in the springtime that are good for pollinators too. We also have the Chinese ground orchid for sale, a true terrestrial orchid. It's a perennial, blooms in the springtime with the pretty pink to magenta colored flowers, foliage almost like a palm tree. So that's the Chinese ground orchid, or Blatilla. We have African hostas or Dremeopsis, a good perennial for most of Texas for the shade. Some fairly attractive blooms that are white, the spotted leopard skin foliage, but unlike a hosta, which doesn't tend to like Texas summers, the quote African hosta or a false hosta is a good perennial for us and long live. We have Byzantine Gladiolus in the sale, which are a rare old pass along that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Actually comes from the Mediterranean, like a lot of other truly adapted bulbs for us. Bright magenta flowers that have highlights of purple and red and orange, and it's the more you stare into a flower of Byzantine Gladiolus, the more colors you see. I started with 5 corms as a kid and eventually built up an entire block of Byzantine Gladiolus. So it's a very good investment. What few are available commercially tend to be really expensive, and so it doesn't take very many to get started with to end up with a bunch as you keep dividing them over the years. So they grow during the early spring, bloom during the mid-spring, go dormant during the summertime, and that's give them 3 or 4 years, and you can dig them up, and each corm will actually multiply in some little cormlets, and you can eventually build up a larger stand or plant them in a row or in mass like I did. I have to warn you, in Dutch catalogs, what they sell as a Byzantine Gladiolus is that tiny pale little flowered creature you see on the right. So the true southern heirloom Byzantine Gladiolus is the large flowered magenta pink one you see on the left, not that little thing you see on the right. And so if you see cheap Byzantine Gladiolus for sale out of Dutch catalogs, this is what you get. Something that multiplies, makes a lot of foliage, a lot of corms, and a few little floppy pale pink flowers. So that's not our heirloom Byzantine Gladiolus. I don't even think this is Gladiolus byzantinus. I think it's Gladiolus italicus or some little imposter. We have Spanish bluebells in our sale. Spanish bluebells look a little bit like blue hyacinths. They're well adapted to good garden soils and in some partial shade. Here you see some in Nacogdoches, Texas. They come in blue and pink and white. The blues are the strongest growers, and so a good plant in this case for naturalizing in shade or perennial borders, or even in the lawn or in the wood. So that's the Spanish bluebell. We do have the white Spanish bluebells in the sale. If you need a white pop of color and some denser shade, just make sure that these things have deciduous shade. We have no foliage on the tree during the winter time. So those that make winter foliage and bloom in the spring, most of our spring bulbs need some winter sunshine. So you don't want to grow them under magnolias or cedar trees or live oaks. You want trees that lose their leaves. Blue Roman hyacinths are actually an old-fashioned bulb that used to be grown as a forest indoor flower long before paper whites got that honor. Unfortunately, they're extremely rare, no longer available in the trade, so we grow a few ourselves to make them available. Very fragrant flowers. It was actually Eudora Welty's favorite flower, famous author from Jackson, Mississippi. Basically, it's a wild hyacinth. So all the Dutch hyacinths that we grow with the gorgeous double flowers and the multiple colors all descended from this plant. So this is what it looked like in the wild in the Mediterranean where it was native. Unfortunately, the really pretty Dutch hyacinths are not perennials for us. They're mostly just annuals that we use for forcing or temporary bedding. Blue Roman hyacinth is actually a long perennial and used to be a famous pass-along southern dooryard plant. The same intoxicating sweet fragrance that you get from any hyacinths. But this is what a hyacinth looked like in the wild. So that's the Blue Roman hyacinths, or once sold as French Roman hyacinths, where they were produced in France. Spring starflower is an interesting little bulb that actually has fragrant flowers that smell like freesias and foliage that smells like garlic. So you don't want to step around on them when you're inhaling the fragrance of the flowers. Great for naturalizing in lawns or flower beds or in perennial borders. Here you see spring starflower Iphion in a lawn setting in the Brick Streets district in Tyler. So beautiful little flower for naturalizing. And then as it goes dormant in the summer, you can certainly mow over the top of it. We have a special bearded iris or German iris in the sale this year. It was actually shared with Dr. Welch and myself by Becky Smith, Texas rose rustler from Fort Bend County. And so somebody that does her hair shared it with her, and so she used to call it the hairdresser iris until Dr. Welch said, that doesn't sound good enough, let's call it the beauty operator iris. I'm sure it has a name, but most bearded iris, when you get close to the coast, and Fort Bend County would be a prime example, tend to wither away because it's too moist and too humid. And so the beauty operator iris not only is done well, it's a repeat blooming iris. And none of the German iris or the bearded iris that I've grown in the past were good repeat bloomers. So if you live further north and further west, there are many kinds of bearded iris you can grow, but not for most of us in Texas and the South. And so this has done extremely well. We've got a limited number available that we produce ourselves and share. If you know its real name, let us know. But from here on out, for us, it's just known as the beauty operator iris. Thank you, Becky Smith, Master Gardener and Texas Rose Rustler from Fort Bend County. The white cemetery iris has been around for hundreds of years, actually thousands of years. So this is the iris that was used on Muslim graves 1,000 years ago, and then it went to Spain, and it came to the United States, and it became the most common cemetery iris in Texas cemeteries. And so it actually changed religions, changed continents, and it's still our most common pass-along iris, even though it's never been sold that I can tell in Texas. So this is a white cemetery iris, or Iris albicans. Once again, not available in the trade, so we produce them and dig them and make them available in this sale. And here you see an abandoned home in downtown Tyler with Iris albicans, just as happy as a lark. So these are the kind of plants I like, those that look pretty and look like you're out there gardening, but you're not. And so if I've got a plant that knows how to do the work itself and still look pretty, I'm fine with it. Now, people in the Iris Society may not like it. It's white, it's not as big and showy, but you know what? It's pretty much the earliest blooming bearded iris of all. And if you have no other iris out there, white's a pretty color. I learned that in San Antonio when I do trials. Any living plant is prettier than any dead plant. Any white flower is prettier than any brown flower. And so things like this that have been around for hundreds and even in this case thousands of years deserve to be in our garden. So that's Iris albicans, the white cemetery iris. Some are snowflakes. Some people call them snowdrops or dewdrops. They're actually don't bloom in the summer. They bloom in the early to mid spring. They're not the same as snowdrops, which are actually a whole different genus, Galanthus, that don't do well here. So if you pick up a catalog, make sure that you're ordering Lycodium, not snowdrops. So these are snowflakes. Beautiful foliage. They'll grow in sun, shade, acid, alkaline, wet, dry. Pretty amazing plant. People always want to ask, do they come in another color? No, but just be happy that they return each year and bloom every year, and don't ask for anything in return. We also have the Gravetie Giant, which was a selection William Robinson made at Gravetie Manor in England years ago, which has slightly larger flowers, slightly glaucous foliage, and blooms a little bit later, so it helps extend the season. So we have the common snowflake and the Gravetie Giant snowflake that are adapted all over Texas, all over the South. Shoot, it's adapted to Europe, the US, the North, the South. It's just an amazing long-lived perennial bulb in the Amaryllis family with delicate little drooping flowers. And it's just as happy in a flower bed or the ground cover or a pasture. And so I use them all over the place. And I started with just a few when I was a kid, and I eventually made thousands and thousands. So there's my Jack Russell Acer, admiring snowflakes in a naturalized stand that I planted. We have the Starch Hyacinth, the only little grape hyacinth that's a long-term perennial in Texas, in the South for that matter. Lots of grape hyacinths grown in Europe. Unfortunately, they're not so adapted to the South, hardly adapted at all. So this is Muscari neglectum, and you'll see it in Texas cemeteries and roadsides where I took this picture, just down the road from my house for that matter. So it can be grown as a flower, or it can be grown as a naturalistic, quote, wildflower in a meadow. This is an oddball plant, the hyacinth squill, Scilla hyacinthoides, known for being tough and long-lived and drought-tolerant. Doesn't always bloom well because it needs a really dry summer. So don't plant it where you get any irrigation. And then after a dry summer, it makes foliage in the early spring. And then in mid-spring, you have these long spikes of blue, pretty flowers, a hyacinth relative. Now let's look at some summer blooming bulbs and some other plants adapted to Texas and southern gardens. One of them we have available is the hardy Gloxinia. Syningia tubiflora actually makes the thick gray-green foliage and these beautiful long tubed white flowers in the late spring and early summer. It's the hardy Gloxinia from South America. A very easy to grow perennial in Texas gardens. A delicate little flower that looks like it's hard to grow, and most of the cultivars available in the world generally don't grow for us very well. This is the orchid pansy, or what are known as Achemines. And Achemines are an old-fashioned pass-along plant. The purple one is pretty much the only one that grows well for us. And my piano teacher, I remember, had these when I was a kid, and I would admire them in the pots on the patio. These are at Keith Hansen's house. He produces them for us. He uses them in pots. Actually uses them some as a tender perennial in his shade garden, but they're best grown in containers in the shade or partial shade. And when they go dormant in the late summer, take your pot, store it in a shed or someplace, the garage, someplace that's not going to freeze during the winter time. Or you can dig up the little rhizomes and store them in a paper bag if you want to. And then after winter is over, put them back out in the springtime, water them, and they'll come back again. So they're actually an African violet relative. So these are Achemines. They make these odd-looking little rhizomes that are delicate little things. So this is what we sell. And so be careful because they're brittle and they'll break apart. The pieces will still come up, but you want to maintain them whole if you can. So store them in a paper bag during the winter time, and then it's going to come in a paper bag when you get them. Then springtime, plant them in pots full of potting soil, put them in partially shaded location, water them, and then they'll come up, and then each year you can dig and divide your own little rhizomes. So those are Achemines rhizomes, beautiful, gorgeous purple flowers that everybody will admire on your patio or balcony. We have Voodoo Lily, not a lot of them. These actually produce a tuber on top of the leaf. So this is a Morphophallus bulbifer, an odd-looking aroid that you can grow as a perennial in shade gardens. Prefer good drainage and organic soils. Otherwise, it's an easy-to-grow tropical-looking perennial. Here you see what they look like. Sometimes called snake lilies too. You can see that interesting-looking petiole on the leaf, and then little bulbs that make for. In addition to the larger tuber that it makes underground, it'll make some little bulbils on top of the leaf that you can hold through the wintertime and plant the next spring. So that's the Voodoo Lily. We have a special heirloom canna in our sale. This is the Florence Vaughan canna, actually the same one that my grandmother Humanis had in her landscape growing up. Very vigorous canna, easy to grow, bright yellow and orange flowers, rarely available in the trade. Unfortunately, many of the cannas in the trade have virus, and it's hard to find good virus-free stock of cannas. So we produce these ourselves, and this is the Florence Vaughan heirloom canna. And there you see them planted at one of our school gardens here in Tyler. A real showstopper. We have two crinums available in the sale this year. This is Crinum Ellen Bosanquet. It's actually the one that my grandmother Humanis had and shared with me. It was her favorite crinum lily. Crinum is actually Greek for lily, so when you say crinum lily, you're really saying lily. Bold pink flowers, grows in full sun to partial shade, spectacular cut flowers, and actually this is the very row that I dug for this sale, so you're getting stock of my grandmother Humanis's pink Ellen Bosanquet crinums. A real long-lived, easy-to-grow perennial. Crinums are to the south what peonies are to the north. Long-lived, family heirloom pass-alongs that make great cut flowers. So that's Ellen Bosanquet. Also have a limited number of a milk and wine lily that I got from Dr. Parsons, who got it from Somerville, Tennessee. There are many different milk and wine lilies that grow in Texas in the south, called milk and wine lilies because they have the striped pink and white flowers. Also a great cut flower. This particular selection is a dwarfer than most milk and wine lilies, so I would essentially call it a semi-dwarf milk and wine lily that Dr. Jerry Parsons shared with me from his home in Somerville, Tennessee. We also have Montbretia in the sale, which are an iris relative that have bright orange flowers. You can see them in the front of this perennial planting that I did for my parents years ago. Long-lived, easy to grow, rapidly multiplying perennial. This was the first hybrid crocosmia on the planet and our best and most adapted Montbretia that we can grow in gardens. And so they formed a good chunk of the orange section of this rainbow border I did at my parents' years ago using only long-lived, tough heirloom pass-along perennials that were free. And so you can make really pretty plantings starting with just a few of a plant that's going to multiply over the years, and you can plant one clump and then divide that clump years later and develop big sweeps and mass stands and perennial borders and larger plantings. Also great, any of these long-lived, truly adapted perennials are great for school gardens and commercial landscapes and older people and non-gardeners. So it's the kind of plants people should be growing, these earth kind bulbs. Hidden ginger is another perennial bulb, summer bulb that we have in our sale. We produce these ourselves. Lush, tropical looking foliage with flowers that are tucked in there. So what a lot of people do when hidden gingers bloom is they go cut off some of the foliage to see the hidden flowers down below. So spectacular looking flowers, kind of orchid-like, make good cut flowers, but also a long-term garden perennial for semi-shaded gardens. The butterfly ginger is a famous fragrance throughout the tropics in the south, Hedychium coronarium, not because it attracts butterflies, but named so because each of the flowers looks like a white butterfly. A very intoxicating tropical fragrance. So that's the butterfly ginger. Once again, we produce those ourselves for the sale. It's a rhizome. Butterfly gingers are a lot like cannas and crinums. What they just soon grow in is moist soil and full sun. So if you want the best butterfly gingers, plant them in mud in the sun, and they'll do the best. This year we have a different double orange daylily. In the past, we've had the Kwanzaa, a 1,000-year-old cultivar of double orange daylily, which is basically semi-double or twice double. This year we're going to have the old cultivar Flora plena, which is essentially a triple flowering double orange daylily, a little bit shorter than Kwanzaa, and actually showier than Kwanzaa. Here you see some used in a cut flower arrangement. Here they are in my perennial border. So these are ones we produce ourselves, not available in the trade anymore, but a really spectacular double orange daylily that anybody can grow. Rust resistant, long lived. I actually got my start off a roadside planting in Henderson when they were doing some highway construction. The poor things were getting graded out of the ditch, and so picked up a few tuberous roots and planted them on my border, and now we're dividing those and making them available in this sale. So that's Flora plena, the triple orange daylily. Tropical giant spider lily is one that's not commonly available commercially because they're hard to dig, great big bulbs, a relative of crinums, spectacular spidery white flowers that are fragrant that bloom around July 4th each year. So a good plant for sun, but also for partial shade. Tropical, lush, beautiful long-lived perennial, the tropical giant spider lily or Hymenicalis. Philippine lilies are one of the true lilies that do well in Texas and the south. Blooms right in the middle of summer when it's hot as blue blazes, with these fragrant white flowers that are pollinated by hawk moths at night. And not only does it come back as a perennial, it actually sets seeds and will naturalize. And so you can let the seeds fall and they come up like little tiny blades of grass. Most people don't recognize them and tend to weed them out or mulch them. But if you let them naturalize, you can have large stands. I started with a few years ago from Christine Langston in Arlem, Texas, and I wasn't going to be happy till I had as many Philippine lilies as she did, and I almost do now. So there you see my stand of Philippine lilies at home, which is where I dig the ones for our sale. So a great naturalizing, long-lived perennial lily for Texas. It looks like an Easter lily, except it blooms in the middle of the summertime. We'll make a tall plant in the shade or a shorter plant in the full sun. Beautiful flowers. Now we're going to talk about fall blooming bulbs for Texas. Fall bulbs have the same growth cycle as the spring bulbs, except they put up the flower before the foliage starts. Spring blooming bulbs put up their flowers at the end of the foliage. And we all know we get hot and dry in Texas, and things die, and the grass dies, and the shrubs die, and the ponds and the streams dry up. Well, guess what? For the bulbs that do well here are spring and fall bulbs. They actually need it to get dry during the summertime. So they work on this wet-dry cycle. So whereas a tulip and a hyacinth chilling sets the blooms in there, with our spring and fall blooming bulbs here, it's the drought during the summer that sets the bloom in there. And then when you get rainfall about the time school starts, and then you have our typical moist winter times, that's when they grow their foliage. And so there's nothing wrong. Anytime we're in the middle of a drought, I always think about how happy my Oxblood lilies and my jonquils are, because they need that dry conditions. So some of the fall blooming bulbs we have in the sale this year would be the hardy cyclamen, Cyclamen heterofolium, the only perennial cyclamen that I know that's adapted to Texas in the south. Beautiful little delicate flowers during the fall and scattered in the winter and in the springtime. Then they go dormant during the summertime. And then when you get rainfall in the fall, they make these beautiful leaves that look a lot like English ivy, where they got the name Cyclamen heterofolium, so foliage like English ivy. So basically silvery green foliage during the wintertime, dormancy during the summertime, and then delicate little flowers in the spring. We have two rain lilies in the sale this year. This is the pink rain lily, Hebranthus robustus. Beautiful pink flowers. It's actually a wild species, so it sets seed and naturalizes, so you'll have volunteer seedlings come up. And so you can start with a few pink rain lilies and eventually have whole beds of pink rain lilies, and then do like I do, plant them in naturalized stands out in the lawn or pasture if you want to. So that's Hebranthus robustus from South America. We also have the white rain lilies, Amaranthes candida from Argentina, long-lived, truly adapted white rain lily for Texas and the South. Dr. Welch used to use this as a border for his perennial borders instead of using in monkey grass, which I thought was really attractive. Silvery white flowers. And here you see some I have planted in some variegated Asian jasmine. So they'll pop up through ground cover, they'll pop up through lawns, they'll pop up through mulch, but are perfectly happy growing in the roadside or the lawn or pasture or the ditches where the water fills up, soaks them, and after a rain in the summer or the fall, the rain lilies will be in bloom 3 days later. We have some really special Lycoris or spider lilies in our sale. One of them is Lycoris LZE. These are things I got from the late Cleo Barnwell in Shreveport, and she got them from the late Lycoris collector and breeder Sam Caldwell in Tennessee. So this is what I call the peach-flowered spider lily. Numbers are limited on these things because I started with a few, multiplied them through the years, and I dig these for our sale myself. And so I'm getting older. I don't have tons of them, but I dig what I can each year. And each year we hope to have some different special Lycoris available in the sale. So this is Lycoris LZE, now classified. It's one of the cultivars of Lycoris albiflora. Tony Avent gave it the cultivar name Dorman. There you see them naturalized. I say naturalized. I planted each one of these because they don't set any seed. It's a sterile hybrid. These are growing alongside my Oxblood lilies out in front of my house. We have red spider lilies in the sale, Lycoris radiata. I mention that because what you order out of commercial sources or fertile Lycoris radiata, they're not near as tough as these Lycoris radiata, which is a sterile triploid. Sets no seed, it's like a mule. So it's a mule plant, sterile, means all the energy goes into making flowers and bulbs and foliage. Much bigger bulbs than what you typically buy the commercial strains. And so long-lived, here they are at the old home place where my mother was born, or born, as she and Loretta Lynn say. So long-lived perennial, blooms around September, about a month after the Oxblood lilies bloom. Makes foliage during the wintertime, goes dormant during the summertime, and then blooms each fall. Really special Lycoris in the sale that we have limited numbers of is Lycoris jacksoniana, now technically called Lycoris rosea. Beautiful magenta flowers with electric blue or purple highlights on the flowers. So it literally looks unreal. As a kid, I was in love with Lycoris radiata, the spectacular, delicate looking flowers that were so easy to grow, and I had no idea that they came in white and creams and yellows and blues and pinks and purples and stripes. And so I collect these things, and they're rare, but there are probably 700 kinds available in the world. I've only got about 50, but I'm hoping to have all 700 before I'm dead. And this is one of my favorite of all, the magenta colored blue-tipped Lycoris jacksoniana, a spider lily. Looks just like our red spider lily, except it has magenta flowers with blue highlights. We'll also have a limited number of Lycoris albiflora, which has flowers that start off a creamy, peachy colored, maybe more apricot, depending on the temperatures, and then fade to almost white. It's the most, what I call the fanciest of the Lycoris flowers, with the ruffled edges and the reflex petals, and then they fade to almost white. So the white spider lilies that have been sold in the past were actually different hybrids between the yellow flowered Lycoris aurea and the red flowered Lycoris radiata. And so they come in a range of colors, from creams to peaches to salmons and whatnot. And so different temperatures can bring out the different colors. So this is Lycoris albiflora, rare in the trade, and we have some available in our sale. Certainly we have Oxblood lilies, one of the most adapted, longest lived, multiplying bulbs that you can grow in Texas, anywhere from alkaline soils from the hill country to sandy acid soils in East Texas. Grows in sun, shade, wet, dry, acid, alkaline. Blooms about the time school starts each year, hence the name schoolhouse lilies. So no matter how dry the summer, when you get the first rainfall, and they love a historic drought and a hurricane that dumps 4 or 5 inches of rain, and like the rain lilies that they're related to, 3 days later they'll be in full bloom. Actually, this year after the hurricane that came through, it rained in the morning 3 inches, and by evening time, the flower buds were already peeking up, wanting to come out of there. So this is the red oxblood lily, Rhodophylla bifida from Argentina. And I started with 3 years ago and eventually built up a block of about 10,000. So I plant them everywhere. And so when summer's over in Texas and it finally rains, it's nice to know that there is a God after all, and there will be flowers and life again. And oxblood lilies are the first ones to announce that to us. Something very special and rare we have in our sale are the pink oxblood lilies. I first fell in love with years ago when I saw a single plant at the Antique Rose Emporium. It's taken me years and years to build up stock of pink oxblood lilies, and we have them in limited numbers available in the sale. So it's a variety of a Rhodophylla bifida called Cephisses, and because they're seedlings, the red doesn't set a lot of seed, the pink sets fertile seed, and so they can actually be different shades of pink, and sometimes even the seedlings will be red, which I'll cull out of them. So these are pink oxblood lilies, and I have a whole acre landscape where I'm trying to naturalize pink oxblood lilies. And so, like all my other bulbs, I dig and divide. And one year I grew out a flat of seedlings, and I used those, planted them in a row, and then dig those clumps, one to make available in our sale, and two to naturalize in our planting. And so when I get a red seedling, like you see in the background there, I dig those up and move them to another property. So one of my properties is all one of the properties is all red oxblood lilies and red spider lilies, and one of the properties is all pink oxblood lilies, pink rain lilies, and pink spider lilies. I want it to look like, I want Monet to look down from heaven and think he painted this. Now, one thing I do with our oxblood lilies and our spider lilies, I dig them all in full bloom. And you say, why? Doesn't that hurt them? Well, it doesn't. But the reason I dig them in bloom is to make sure that every bulb you buy is a blooming size bulbs. But you need to know that when you dig a spider lily or a lycoris, they have year-round roots, and so generally they don't bloom the first year, and then once they get re-rooted back into the ground, they bloom hopefully every year after that for the rest of your life, and then even beyond the rest of your life. And so I dig them in full bloom so you know that you're getting a blooming size bulbs, and I'm 100% sure that you're getting the cultivar that we're telling you you're getting. And so that's lycoris LZ that I was digging this year. All of the lycoris make spectacular cut flowers. This is both lycoris incarnata and lycoris jacksoniana, both of which we have in the sale. Flower larkspur, what we call bunny bloom larkspur, is known for having a little bunny rabbit in the middle of each flower and blooming at Easter time. So great for kids and adults alike to have a flower that blooms at Easter that has a rabbit in the middle of each flower. So this is bunny bloom larkspur that can be pink, white, blue, or purple. So we're selling seed of this in our sale this year. We also have a poppy that I developed. I refer to it as the Aggie poppy because it's got maroon flowers. I'm an Aggie, of course. Papaver laciniatum grants garnet. Last year was the first year it was ever made available from seed. This year I was being interviewed on the radio program at Milberger's Nursery in San Antonio last weekend, and they're actually selling, thanks to the volunteer group down there in Extension, they were selling Aggie poppies as well. And I pointed out there's only 2 places on the planet that you can get these Aggie poppies: at the Smith County Master Gardener's bulb sale in the fall and at Milberger's Nursery. Otherwise, they don't exist anywhere on the planet because we produce these ourselves. So both Keith Hansen, the former county horticulture steer, and I grow seed and we make them available. And this is only the 2nd year we've had it available. So these Aggie poppies here, seeing the Byzantine Gladiolus, you'll plant them in full sun on bare soil in the fall, same time you plant larkspur and bluebonnets. Don't plant them too thick. The seed are tiny. You might want to mix them with sand to help distribute the seed. Thin them out to about 6 inches or a foot apart. They make a rosette of foliage during the wintertime, just like a bluebonnet. And come springtime, it bolts and makes the flowers. And then each seed pod will make about 100 seeds. So it doesn't take very many plants for you to save up and have lots of poppy seed of your own. So that's my Aggie poppy that we have available in the sale. Also, we have a special purple coneflower that I got from Cleo Barnwell, the same lady that shared the lycoris special selections and varieties of lycoris with me. She had this purple coneflower naturalized around her landscape. It's basically like a wild Echinacea purpurea, much more prolific and tougher in reseeding than the fancy strains of purple coneflowers that you buy at the nursery. Here you see a 2-year-old planting at the Heritage Rose Garden at the Tyler Botanic Garden, where I just scattered seed in our flower bed. The Master Gardeners got a little upset because they took over the roses, but it's It's a really tough, easy to grow purple coneflower that I named for Cleo Barnwell. Here's something brand new to the world that nobody else has available to them. It's a pea that I developed. Get this. It has maroon pods, maroon and white peas in longhorn patterns. And of course the purple hull makes it easy to pick. So this is my Aggie pea that I named Purple Cow. And now you're just going to get enough to plant a small stand the first year. And so don't harvest any to eat the first year. I love peas. I like cream peas. I like Crowder peas. I like black-eyed peas, you name it. So this is actually a Crowder pea, which means bigger peas in there crammed into the pod. And so you're going to let the pods dry the first year, pick the dried pods, shell them out, and then the following year you should have enough to plant a small row. And so this is not available commercially anywhere else, so you're going to have to actually multiply your own seed. Hopefully we'll have some available each year, but I don't have near as much time to farm now, so it's your job to take my Aggie pea with the longhorn pattern on it and save up seed and share them with people so everybody else can have their Aggie peas. I had this goal. I'm going to like Gregor Mendel. I like to develop southern peas, and so I want all peas to have purple hulls because it makes them easier to pick. I say purple. It really makes a maroon pod and a maroon and white pea. So that's my new Aggie pea available in our sale and no place else on the planet. We've got some woody plants available in our sale as well. One of them is the Brandywine red maple. I love red maples for their beautiful fall color. And so there you see a spectacular specimen of the Brandywine red maple. Red maples are actually more adapted to East Texas and the Southeast and the Northeast for that matter. So not your best choice for the alkaline soils in Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio, but great shade trees for East Texas with beautiful fall colors. We have Little Gem Magnolia, which is a dwarfer, sort of a semi-dwarf version of a magnolia. Smaller leaves and smaller flowers, great for specimens, also great for hedges. So the Little Gem Magnolia. We have Merlot Redbud, which is actually a hybrid between a Texas Redbud and an Eastern Redbud. And it's an improvement on Forest Pansy, a darker purple foliage with shiny leaves that hold their purple color further into the summer with the usual pink redbud flowers in the spring. So that's Merlot Redbud. We have Shoal Creek Vitex, which is a Texas Superstar selection, along with Montrose Purple and LeCount. Longer blue-purple spikes of flowers during the summertime. Drought-tolerant, full sun, easy to grow, small tree for Texas. So that's the Shoal Creek Vitex. We have the Belle of Georgia peach, which is actually an old heirloom white flesh peach. Peaches aren't the easiest, longest-lived trees to grow in Texas gardens, but this goes back to a time when people didn't do so much spraying on their trees. Still going to need typical peach tree care, but a nice white flesh, sweet, delectable heirloom peach that we can grow in our gardens here. The Belle of Georgia. I actually grew enough several years that I used to put up what I could eat, and then I would sell the extras, and so I used to actually produce some Belle of Georgia peaches. Great, wonderful peach. Basham's Party Pink is actually a Texas Superstar selection, and most people don't realize it was the first hybrid crepe myrtle on the planet. Occurred in Bill Basham's yard in Houston as a chance seedling, cross between Lagerstromia aureae and Lagerstromia indica. Fast growing, 30-foot tall crepe myrtle tree, sets very little seed, which means it blooms a long time during Texas summers. So that's Basham's Party Pink crepe myrtle, a Texas Superstar selection. We also have the Enduring Summer Red crepe myrtle, which is a dwarf red or a semi-dwarf red, great for growing in perennial borders or growing as a shrub with true red flowers. So that's the Enduring Summer crepe myrtle. We have Texas Everbearing Fig, one of the 3 cold hardy figs recommended for Texas gardens, along with Brown Turkey and Celeste. And so Texas Everbearing, nice long-lived heirloom fig for Texas gardens with delectable fruit. We have the Hashia Japanese Persimmon, which is a seedless, large Japanese persimmon, easy to grow, great ornamental tree, and certainly edible as well. And this is something cool that most people don't have available. It's a Mexican beautyberry, Calicarpa acuminata, that has maroon fruit. So most people are familiar with the pink or purple or magenta colored berries on American beautyberry. The Mexican beautyberry can range anywhere from black to purple to maroon. So this is the Aggie Mexican beautyberry selection that gets passed around among we plant geeks for its maroon colored larger clusters and larger berries, the maroon beautyberry. We have some red buckeyes. Now these are small trees. Red buckeyes have evolved to go dormant during the summertime, so they look like little naked plants. Put them out in the full sun or partial shade to grow spectacular red flowers. One of the native plants, when it blooms, it's when the hummingbirds are migrating back from South America. So when you see red buckeyes in bloom and you see coral honeysuckle, you know that the ruby-throated hummingbirds have come back. So not common in the trade, but a great native small tree or shrub for Texas gardens. We have Apache blackberry, which is a University of Arkansas introduction, thornless, large, sweet fruit. So that's Apache blackberry, a good one for Texas gardens in the southeast. This is a new blueberry that we have available, actually bred at the University of Georgia, bred to be both an ornamental and edible for the multicolored fruit. Of course, those that you eat, you want to wait till they get actually black, blue-black on there, so the longer they stay on the plant, the sweeter they get, like other rabbit-eye blueberries. So it's actually a complex hybrid with mostly rabbit-eye blueberry in there. So that's the summer sunset blueberry, best for the acid soils of East Texas. Any place you can grow an azalea, camellia, or gardenia. So blueberries are essentially azaleas for full sun. Now I like to write, so hopefully you like to read. You can read about lots of gardening topics, including lots of writings I do about bulbs. There are 3 books that have written that we have available at our sale. If you'd like autographed copies, we have Texas Fruit and Vegetable Gardening, Heirloom Gardening in the South that I did with Dr. Welch, and the Rose Rustlers that Dr. Welch and I did. All 3 of those we have available as part of this sale, autographed. I also write a Greg's Rambling blog at arbogate.com. I write in the Greg's Garden column for Texas Gardener magazine in every issue, and have for some 20 years now. I write a garden column every Sunday in the Tyler Morning Telegraph, and I usually post all of those articles on my Greg Grant Gardens Facebook page. So if you don't subscribe to those, you want to read the articles, look up Greg Grant Gardens on the Facebook page. And they tend to also get posted on our Smith County Master Gardeners Facebook page as well. Here are the books we have for sale that I can autograph for you: Heirloom Gardening in the South, Texas Fruit and Vegetable Gardening, and the Rose Rustlers. Also, if you want to learn more about bulbs, garden bulbs for the South, the 2nd edition written by Scott Ogden is the most definitive expert bulb source of information for Texas and the South, written by friend Scott Ogden. He and I used to both live and work in San Antonio at the same time. So if you want to know about spring bulbs, fall bulbs, and summer bulbs, garden bulbs for the South is it. You can order that off of Amazon. Also, Daffodils in Florida, a field guide to the coastal South, is a great book if you want to learn about jonquils, narcissus, and daffodils for Texas and the South, written for Florida, but a similar climate to East Texas. You can order those from the American Daffodil Society. Bulbs for Warm Climates, written by Thad Howard, the late Thad Howard. He was an amaryllis expert, quite the expert on crinums and rain lilies. She was a veterinarian in San Antonio. And so this is out of print now, but you might find it on Amazon, Bulbs for Warm Climates by the late Thad Howard. Also, there's Chris Weisinger and Dr. Welch's The Bulb Hunter book. So if you want to read about the story of Chris and the Southern Bulb Company and the different bulbs that do well in Texas, you'll want to check out a copy of The Bulb Hunter, available from Amazon or also Texas A&M Press. We also have a special Narcissus. Each year we have a silent auction plant, but since we're offering the sale online this year, we're going to sell raffle tickets for a special Narcissus. So it's the Miss Parnell Narcissus, a special heirloom shared with me from cousin Celia Jones. Her grandmother grew it at Sister's Bulb Farm in Gibbslands, Louisiana. Miss Parnell's the one that shared it with her. They say it's Klondike Narcissus, an old Polyanthus poetess Narcissus, although it's supposed to be bright yellow, and the Miss Parnell is actually a bicolor, creamy white, yellow primrose with a bright yellow cup with really ruffled fluted edges on there. So a great long-lived special heirloom Narcissus that's not available in the trade. So if you'd like to buy a chance at that, one of the things we have available in the sale. Thank you, cousin Celia from Sister's Bulb Farm, for donating our heirloom Miss Parnell Narcissus for our raffle this year. If you don't get something that you wanted out of our sale, here's some other sources for southern heirloom bulbs or long-lived perennial southern bulbs that do well. There's jinxfarmer.com, oldhousegardens.com, plantdelights.com, and southernbulbs.com. So all of those have special and unique and long-lived and heirloom and good perennial bulbs for Texas and the South. We want to thank Ed McGee, who founded this sale over 20 years ago. A friend of mine, he and Joe Helen, Smith County Master Gardeners Deluxe. So a great project that's still going. Thank you, Ed. I want to thank the Smith County Master Gardeners who have spent thousands of hours and thousands of dollars putting on these sales each year. Keith Hansen, the former Smith County horticulturist, thank you for PR and bulbs that you provided for the sale. I want to thank the City of Tyler providing the Harvey Hall Convention Center where we have the sale each year. I want to thank Neil Sperry, good friend of mine, for PR he gives us for the sale. I want to thank Texas Gardener Magazine, who I write for, Jay White, for giving us PR for the sale as well. Now, I want you to know that the money that we make from the sale, this didn't go in my pocket, this didn't go in anybody's pocket. It goes to support the Smith County Master Gardeners Association and all the educational projects they do, including the Tyler Botanical Garden, the Heritage Rose Garden, the Shade Garden, the Idea Garden, which we fund and maintain and work in every week of the year. And so we do lots of projects in Smith County and Tyler, Texas, and so the proceeds from this sale go to support the Smith County Master Gardeners Association as our main fundraiser each year. And remember, this is a volunteer organization, so this is the first year we've ever attempted to have this sale virtually and online, and so it may not go as smooth as you like, but always remember these are volunteers that don't get paid. We're trying the best we can, so please cut everybody some slack. We do a really great sale every year, but this year, thanks to COVID, we've had to pull it off online. So realize these are 150 people, all volunteers working because they like beautification and education. So please be patient this year as we have this sale online for the first time ever. That's the end. Thank you for joining us. This will be available on the Smith County Master Gardeners page. This will be available on the Greg Grant Gardens Facebook page. And so share it with your friends, purchase as many bulbs as you can. If you don't get what you wanted, check out the sources that I mentioned here, and hopefully next year we'll be able to host our sale back at Harvey Hall in Tyler in person again, because I do love speaking to you in person where I can see whether you're asleep or not. So thanks for joining us.